All right. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Jorge Valdes, for those of you who don't know me. This summer I was working with Dr. Tom Meissner at the University of Arizona, and I was researching the variability of decomposition rates in urbanized areas across a climate gradient. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you can see in this map, urbanization has expanded at rates, beyond anything in the past couple hundred years. And we know that urbanized areas drastically disturb local ecosystems. The World Health Organization estimated the urban population of the world in 1960 at 34%, and in 2014, 54% of the total population resided in urban areas. And this continues to grow. They also estimate that for the next 5 years, the urban population of the world will increase by 1.84% every year. And with population growth, we'll see a lot more land development. And it's been estimated that only less than 0.5% of the planet's surface area is covered by impervious surfaces, and that seems like an incredibly small amount of land, but judging by what we know about how they impact local ecosystems, we should definitely be a lot more mindful about what might happen as we continue to develop land. Next slide, please. So this summer I was looking at how urbanization is affecting leaf litter decomposition rates. And to just talk a little bit about leaf litter decomposition, it's the primary component of the nutrient cycle. It contributes to soil formation and is mostly controlled by temperature, moisture, and the organisms that break down the material. And I'll talk about how in the next couple slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so greater temperatures increase decomposition rates because microbial activity decreases at lower temperatures. In the study where I got this figure from, they compared decomposition rates in similar streams at 3 different latitudes, in Costa Rica, Michigan, and in Alaska. And when they normalized the results for temperature, that being the bottom half of the figure, decomposition rates in Alaska were fastest. And the reason for that is that the soil organisms are more active in higher latitudes when the temperature is above freezing. Also, shredder and microbial activity in different environments are well adapted to their thermal regimes, so that means that processing rates are going to be much different in different environments. Next slide, please. Additionally, urbanization has led to a phenomenon called the urban heat island effect, which causes an urban area to be up to an average of 3 degrees warmer than nearby rural areas. As you can see in the top left corner, it's the urban heat island profile, and it shows that temperatures in downtown areas are significantly higher than surrounding rural areas. Also, things that contribute to the urban heat island effect are lack of vegetation, heat re-radiated from buildings at night, and plenty of other things that you can see in the bottom right infograph there. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking now about how moisture affects decomposition rates in water systems. Next slide, please. So greater precipitation increases decomposition rates because microbial activity is higher when soil moisture is consistent, and also because the leaching process increases more with greater precipitation. Surface runoff decreases the amount of available nutrients released during composition and removes it from the system and takes it elsewhere. Also, impervious surfaces are the dominant form of land cover in urban areas, which replaces natural ground cover, and this disrupts the water cycle by increasing surface runoff and decreasing infiltration rate. So you can see in the infograph on the left, with natural ground cover, only 10% of the water from a rain event is runoff. But if you just increase that to 10 to 20% impervious surfaces, you get 20% runoff rather than 10% from a rain event. And in areas that are mostly covered in impervious surfaces, between 75 and 100% of it, you get 55% runoff. So that's a pretty big increase in surface runoff. So that being said, water that would naturally either infiltrate, evaporate, or be transpired by plants is becoming surface runoff, and increasingly so as we continue to pave over natural ground. Stormwater managers a long time ago used to focus on getting surface runoff off of the paved surfaces as quickly as possible, and sometimes not worrying so much about what to do with it after. But this has very different local and downstream impacts. For example, you get increased flooding events in urban areas, as you can see in the hydrograph on the top right corner. It shows that stream discharge was peaked much higher and much earlier than the stream discharge in a forested watershed before urbanization. Also, further down, locally and further downstream, urbanized areas can experience erosion, as you can see in the bottom right image, where the stream has eroded partially away at its banks and taken some of the road with it. Now, with the increasing demand for water as populations grow, managers are trying to find ways to conserve water, and there are lots of efforts being made to harvest stormwater. And this leads to differences in stormwater infrastructure due to changes in technology over time, and that creates dissimilarities within and across cities, which further exacerbates the problem by creating heterogeneity in hydrologic functions. Next slide, please. So this study looked at how different streamflow regimes in semi-arid and arid climates affected decomposition rates. And it showed that environments that were wetter for longer periods of time showed increased rates of litter decomposition, the fastest decomposition rate being in the seasonally intermittent streams. And additionally, the more water that's present, the faster the rate of decomposition. So leaf litter in the middle of a channel of a stream would decompose much faster than leaf litter in the upland sites. Next slide, please. So in order to test how decomposition rates are affected by urbanization, we identified 4 different environments in urbanized areas. Parks and lawns, which have a lot of foot traffic, and vegetation that's usually maintained through irrigation. Bioswale, which is it's a landscape element used to redirect stormwater for plant use and stormwater infiltration. Detention basins, where stormwater fills a basin and is allowed to infiltrate the ground surface, similar to a bioswale. And an upland area, which kind of served as a control site, because they're the most similar to natural conditions. And we looked at how decomposition rates would vary between them. Also, different cities are likely to have differences between similar environments because of the variations in climate. So we chose 4 different cities to conduct the experiment in. Next slide, please. These sites were chosen in accordance with members of the UWIN project and also to create a climate gradient.
I'm sorry,
That's okay.
It didn't work, so let me try again. Okay.
There we go. Okay, so as I said, these sites were chosen in accordance with members of the UWIN project and also to create a climate gradient. So I'll just give you a little information on each of the cities. So Tucson is in a semi-arid desert, average high temperature of 84 degrees year-round, though days above 100 degrees are common in the summer months. It receives an average of 12 inches of annual precipitation, which mostly falls during the North American monsoon in the summer. Also, Riverside, California resides in a Mediterranean climate, average high of 80 degrees annually, average annual precipitation of 10.3 inches, most of which falls from December to March. Then College Park, Maryland is in a humid subtropical climate with an average high of 67 degrees, average annual precipitation of 44.3 inches, and is greatest during, the precipitation is greatest during its summer months. And then Miami, Florida, in a tropical monsoon climate, average high of 84 degrees, average of 62 inches of precipitation annually, most of which falls during the wet season lasting from May to October. Next slide, please. And in particular, I was trying to answer these 2 questions. How does the rate of leaf litter decomposition compare across different urban environments within different climates and similar urban environments across different climates? Next slide, please. These are some crude graphs I created to represent my hypotheses. we initially thought Miami would have the fastest decomposition rates because it has the perfect combination of hot and very wet conditions during the experimental period, whereas Riverside would be the driest and the coolest. And then the difference between Tucson and College Park would have depended on the intensity of the North American monsoon that affects the Southwest during this time of year. So far, it hasn't been too strong, so we're probably looking at faster decomposition in College Park than Tucson, which is the opposite of what's shown in the diagram on the left. Another thing about Tucson is that since it experiences so many days during the summer over 100 degrees, it's got the temperature part down. The only thing is dependent on the rain. But College Park does get a lot more rain, so again, that just emphasizes that depending on how strong the monsoon is depending on the results for Tucson. For the urban systems, we thought that the upland sites would experience the slowest decomposition rates. One, because they're the most natural, and also a study done by McDonnell and others in 1997 found this to be true. We also thought that detention basins would experience the fastest decomposition rates because occasionally stormwater runoff would submerge the litter, keeping it wet for a longer period of time. And then the parks probably would have seen somewhat slower decomposition rates than bioswales because since water flows through bioswales, that would increase the physical breakdown of the material by abrasion. And also parks get a lot of foot traffic through them, which has an effect on the biodiversity, specifically organisms that break down organic matter. Next slide, please. So to test this, we deployed 18 6x6 fiberglass mesh litter bags that contained about 10 grams of honey mesquite leaf litter in each of the 4 environments within each of the 4 cities. 3 were collected from each site at 1-week intervals for 6 weeks, and each bag was weighed, dried at 55 degrees Celsius for 48 hours, and then weighed again to measure the moisture content and the mass loss. And percent mass remaining from each litter bag was used to determine decomposition rate. Next slide, please. So my experiment is still not yet complete, and you might notice from the graphs in the slide that the data is looking pretty weird right now. Leaf litter isn't supposed to gain mass over time. It decomposes and loses mass. And I realized during sample processing that a lot of the samples are contaminated with sediment, so I came up with an idea to isolate the leaf litter from soil. And so what I'm going to do, or try at least, is to line a sieve with the same mesh that I used to construct a litter bag. And I'll put the material in there, and hopefully it'll separate the sediments, and then I can get more accurate measurements when I weigh them again. It seems so far that decomposition rates are faster in the park environments, and this probably has to do with the fact that the parks and lawns are irrigated, meaning they're regularly irrigated, meaning that they're exposed longer to moisture. But it's kind of hard right now to tell the difference between each city, though by week 3, Miami shows the smallest percent of mass remaining relative to the other 2. Data from Riverside isn't shown right now because there are some complications with the data. And in the near future, we'll also be analyzing particle size distribution and carbon-nitrogen content of soil samples from each site, and we'll also be doing carbon-nitrogen analyses of leaves before and after deploying. Next slide, please. The final results of this experiment can be used by stormwater managers to get a better understanding of how they should manage surface water runoff so as to not alter the natural process of nutrient cycling in their local ecosystem. For future experiments, I would suggest to employ a longer experimental period, a variety of leaf litter, more in-depth soil and leaf litter analyses, and greater variety of climatic conditions. And to address that last point, there's an experiment going on now that I recently found out about called the Teabag Index. It's a citizen science project, and it's basically a worldwide effort to measure decomposition rates in different soils and climates, and they're using 2 types of tea bags to test that. So that concludes my presentation. I'd just like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Tom Meixner and the people in his lab for their efforts in helping me with my project, to the 3 collaborators across the country for their participation, and of course to the National Science Foundation for funding the Urban Water Innovation Network and this project. And thank you for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions on the next slide.